Hello, this is Serge Koenig, and my goal today with my rotational grazing talk is to have you consider it as a viable enterprise on your farms. Um, I have been working as a conservation technician for Sauk County Land Conservation Department here in Baraboo for the past 26 years. And we do advocate for rotational grazing pretty heavily. But lately, we've been diving into some of the enterprise budgeting and helping landowners make sense of what makes sense to switch. Does it make sense to switch to rotational grazing? Does it make sense to split out the cropping enterprise so that we incorporate rotational grazing as part of that soil health principle? Obviously, we want to keep the soil covered, diversity of plants, but worked into that also is the idea of bringing animals back onto the landscape to mimic what was here 400 or 500 years ago. And so my goal today is to kind of give you some exposure to the concepts of rotational grazing, why it might be worth looking into, and to see if it would work on your farm as a viable enterprise from a money-making standpoint and also from an environmental protection standpoint. So we'll just get started on that note. All right, so managed rotational grazing. Most of you have heard this already and know what grazing is, but for those who haven't or need a refresher, I'll just let's back us up a good 400 or 500 years or so in this area in Wisconsin. And let's just see what that was like back in the day. And so what you'll notice here is an abundant vegetation, an abundance of cover over the ground with a diverse array of grasses and forbs and wildflowers and legumes. And along with that abundant vegetation is a vast root system. And some of these grasses and forbs, I've seen the soil pits where they dig them up just to see how vast the roots are. They're going down 10 to 12 feet. And so such a vast array of roots and deep roots builds a lot of soil over the years. And so, it is a benefit when, when it's dry for a while, these roots they go down deep enough where they can get water to keep themselves going during those hot periods. And so that's one of the advantages. One of the other advantages is it's a lot of our soils here were very deep, rich, fertile topsoil that form what we call mollisols, which are a soil type. And a lot of this came to be because of this vast root system where we're harnessing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, combining it with some sunlight and water, and we make sugars. We link the sugar molecules, glucose molecule. We make glucose in essence out of it, and that glucose is transported into the soil and becomes organic matter, humus, organic matter over time. It takes time to do that, but that's what's happening. And during that time, the thought of stream bank erosion, it's kind of a moot point. I mean, the soils are kept in place. Yes, there's always a little bit of erosion, but it's such a minor thing that we wouldn't think to go in and riprap it or protect it, armor it in some way. There's also one thing we had here 300-400 years ago was just an array of wildlife. And when I say that, I don't just mean deer. I'm talking about wild birds and so the microfauna and the macrofauna, the small and the big all together, and some that are invisible, that are on these plants in our soils, between the roots, in the roots themselves, in the form of mycorrhiza fungi. And also nutrient-wise, there was no application of synthetic fertilizer at that point. And so the nutrients were were just cycled through efficiently. The plants would die, the plants were gathered, the bison would come through by the millions, the passenger pigeons would come through by the millions. We had elk herds also come through here, and some deer, and once in a while some antelope would roam through here also, but they would leave their dung and their urine behind, and that would be taken up into the plants, and then those nutrients then would fall back to the soil, and which again would feed the next vegetation layer. And so over the years, it's been kind of a closed loop system that's been very efficient. And that's what we try to mimic as much as we can. And so this is what it looked like 300-400 years ago. And where are we today is this has become the diversity on our farms. And corn is definitely king. It's corn and beans and some alfalfa. We've lost a lot of the diversity, and our soils are paying the price for that. And when the soils are paying the price, then the trickle down effect is that our waterways and our groundwater and just the diversity of life on our farms has gone down dramatically. So a lot of these soils were in the grasslands, the mid-continental grasslands. And so part of southern Wisconsin was in that also. These are the deep, rich topsoil mollisols that held a vast array of wildlife, including just millions upon millions of bison that used to roam through here. And it's no coincidence that a majority of our farming then takes place along that same basic shape. And that farming has an impact for sure on our environment. This would be during the Dust Bowls in the 30s. And it's not so different. It's different, for sure it's better today, but it's amazing to me that my parents live in the Stevens Point area. It's amazing to me that we still have quite a bit of soil erosion, wind erosion happening in the central sands. So this may have been in the 30s, but here we are, 80 years later, and we're still dealing with some of the same things. Oftentimes I help them wash their garage and the outside of their house after these windstorms in the central sands. That's from the mismanaging of our soils. And the consequences are far reaching, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. My family and I took a family trip about 5-6 years ago, got in the van and headed down, and spent a few days in New Orleans at the same time. And I thought, I have to see this dead zone for myself. I want to see just how true this is. I hear the scientific accounts, but I kind of want to see it for myself. And so sure enough, we headed down into the Gulf and walked in it. And it's true. It's eerie how dead that area is, where the Mississippi empties out. And I happened to talk to a fisherman, a shrimper, while I was there. And he basically told me, he says, I remember when we used to get in our boats and basically drive the boats for 20 minutes, and we were shrimping and fishing and catching crabs and other things at that point. And now he says, we basically have to go 2 hours before we even think about starting to fish. The dead zone is expanded to that point. And these are pretty fast boats, so they're going out quite a ways. And of course, he pointed his finger at me saying, hey, you guys are kind of to blame for a lot of this. And I couldn't argue with him. And I know that they're struggling up here too. I mean, our farmers up here are also struggling. And so how do we mesh these two together? How do we farm in a way that's in nature's image? That she's had a lot of years, thousands of years practicing it. We've only been on the scene 200-300 years. And so I think she's got a lot more practice than we do. And that way of farming tends to be a little more sustainable and helps the livelihood of the Gulf Shore shrimper and also, the Midwest farmer at the same time. So this is in the Kickapoo River watershed, where only 2% of it was ungrazed. The rest of it, including the woods, was heavily grazed, and then we brought the plow to it, and so much of the sediment is now in our floodplains. I've seen some really interesting pictures where we have one fence post, and then there's another fence post on top of that, and another fence post on top of that. That's just how much those fence posts were buried by all this sediment. It's obviously causing a lot of problems in our waterways when we have this much sediment filling it up. So I think it's safe to say, obviously, we need agriculture. We all like to eat, but we need agriculture that also protects the environment and is part of the solution. And I think one way to do that is to bring livestock back onto our landscape, to imitate the way nature had intended it for eons. And so that would be, I think, one step in the right direction. And this is where we bring in the managed grazing piece. Again, many of you probably already know what managed grazing or rotational grazing is. It's just a strategy of moving animals on the landscape and allowing the vegetation to rest and not overgrazing it. And so basically, if we went back 300 years, the bison herds and the elk herds, they moved in groups, and there were predators around them to kind of keep them grouped up and kept them moving. That would be the wolves and some others. And nowadays we don't have that on the landscape. And that's okay. So what we do to imitate, again, we're trying to imitate nature and how she's done it for a while. What we do to imitate her is by using an electric fence, a polywire type electric fence on a reel. That becomes a predator. They touch that once and they get 6,000 volts through their nose, and they don't touch it again usually. And so that becomes your predator, and that's how we move them through the landscape, is by using electric fencing. A way, again, of imitating nature. So yeah, these are some of the things that rotational grazing brings, environmental stewardship, animal well-being, human health, economic opportunity, and a quality of life that I'd like to touch on moving forward here. And I think it's also important to couple conservation and financial solvency. They are linked at the hip, I would say. And if we ignore one, it's likely to fail. And so for the longest time, I think we in the conservation field focus solely on the conservation piece and didn't think too deeply about the financial part of farming. And I don't think that was a benefit to us or the environment or the farmers that we were working with. And so I think we're all trying to get better at this, knowing that the two have to mesh together. We can conserve every piece of land in Saw County or in Wisconsin, but if everybody goes broke in the process, that's not any good. But if everybody could get rich in the process of making money somehow in farming, but if we trash the environment, eventually it comes back to bite us. And it may not be in a year or two or even 5, but eventually it comes back to bite us. You know how the saying goes, nature always bats last. She just waits us out. And so we have to kind of be smart about it and think through long-term how sustainable something might be or is not. And so one way to do that then, as far as like linking the two at the hip, is we've done a lot of sitting at kitchen tables with producers and kind of running through the numbers with them and based on their numbers. So they bring out all the prices and quantities and how much they put in what field, and I just plug it in and we work together on it. And I mean, it's everything from your starter fertilizer to your MAP to your DAP to your potassium to urea and hydrous, lime. We also talk about, corn populations, that obviously matters, and then the cost per bag of those seeds, proprietary seeds. And there are some other things that I think people might overlook a little bit. And that's every pass across that field. It does still amaze me that we make 2 or 3 passes across a field or more when only one is all you need to establish a crop. And the technology has been around for decades and decades. But so like seeing it on a number standpoint really, I think hits home a little bit better. Maybe chopping the corn stalks isn't necessary. Well, that's about $13 to $15 an acre of gas, wear and tear, everything else. Maybe field cultivator isn't necessary. Maybe vertical tillage isn't necessary. Every pass is, $10 to $20 an acre. And so if the margins are tight to begin with, why would you do it that way? And so and no-till planting isn't anything new. This isn't magic. This has been around for a long time. And many of you probably already practiced that. But some of the costs that tend to get overlooked are, the combining, the grain drying, the trucking, if you've got crop insurance, and then you throw land rent in there. And in this example, this wasn't probably the most productive of his fields, but it was getting 150 bucks, 150 bushels per acre at 335 and a net return of about 33. And this is not uncommon. I do see this quite a bit. It seems like the range is between zero profit-wise, net return per acre. It's between zero and 150 bucks an acre. The best I've ever seen was $167 an acre, and those people are really excellent managers. But with the kind of rent that people are paying, a lot of times it's actually a net loss. It's not profitable at all. And so these numbers help. And so then the next question would be, well, what's the alternative? And this is where I usually would bring up, well, have you thought about rotational grazing? Have you thought about putting animals on the landscape and making money that way versus putting crops on the landscape? Or have you thought about diversifying? Add some animals on the landscape and also continue to crop just to diversify the income. And for many, they usually eventually just switch the whole farm over to the animal side of things because it's just more profitable. And so we'll go through the financial spreadsheet that we kind of created locally. And it's not perfect by any means, but it gets you in the ballpark. And it really shows grazing is a viable alternative. And it does beat corn and beans handily oftentimes. And so it takes into account days of winter feeding, takes into account the price of hay. It was 80 at one point, I think, where it's definitely more than that now. But it takes all that into account and how many tons of hay, how many bales of hay we're going to need. And at the end of it all, it looks at the gross margin analysis. And in this situation, he was at about 300 bucks an acre, gross margin per acre. It was a cow-calf to finish operation. But then we try and take into account the fixed cost also. And again, give or take a few dollars. But the point is that it's very competitive and then some to row cropping, where so often folks are lucky to make 50. It looks like you're making a lot, but by the time you add up all the expenses, it's really not a whole lot. And then if you add rent to it, it's not a whole lot. And if that machinery breaks down, it's really expensive. When the tire breaks, a tire punctures or something, and you got to replace it, well, that's a few $1,000s right there. And so that's where this is really taking off in our county. We're averaging about 400 to 500 acres a year going into it, and we have a few thousand acres now. And a lot of it is from, again, we're trying to link conservation together with the finances. Here's an example of a farm, one of the early farms that converted over. That 10-acre piece to the very right here is really productive land. It's 200 plus bushel per acre land. And he decided, we started just with a few acres, and I think it worked so well for him. He's like, let's just put the whole farm in. And I question whether we should put that 10.2 in, but I think we kind of went through the numbers together, and it was obvious, like, you know what? Oh, I need to get out of this and go into a little more animal agriculture. And this is what his land looked like to begin with. If you notice the runoff coming from there. And a lot of that water looks pretty chocolate brown, and that's what our streams look like. And all this is slowly being flushed down to the Baraboo and to the Mississippi and down to the Gulf, and the shrimpers down there are dealing with it. And we're losing productivity off of our own land. Why would we shove that downstream when we could use it up here? And so this is what it looked like beforehand. And we went in with a 7-way mix of white clover, red clover, and alfalfa, and 5 or 6 different grasses that were thrown in there. But Mother Nature threw in probably 20 or 30 more in the seed bank, from the seed bank. And so here's what the components look like then. You can see there's a water line there to the right, and we've put the water lines above ground so it's easy to fix if something breaks. And you can see that there's a quick disconnect coupler that we place those every 150 to 200 feet. And that goes to like a 30-foot garden hose that is then goes into like a 20 or 40 gallon tank that is dumped whenever you move the animal. So they'll have food, they'll have water, and they'll have each other. And because of that, they don't push the fences. And so in this situation though, like most of the producers that I work with, they take cost sharing in order to pay for the infrastructure so that they're not, so that they're in the black much quicker. Otherwise, it's going to take a few years to pay back the fencing and the water lines. And so most folks just take the cost sharing to do that, but it's not necessary. And some don't, but most do. I would say 90% do. And here's that 10-acre field, that 200 bushel corn ground. And here are his animals moving through there. He's made paddocks like a couple days, 2 or 3 days in advance. And to walk across there and make this fencing and erect this fencing is about 2 minutes. I've timed it. And move the water lines, move the tank, I should say, is another 2 minutes. And to pull some sort of a mineral feeder is another 2 minutes. So it's about 10 minutes worth of work, but figure a half an hour by the time you put your boots on and get in your UTV or walk down there. And then walk back and take your boots off and go to the next event. So that's this farm. And then we'll host pasture walks just to show people how the system works. And it's really making a difference, I would say. And so on that farm alone, it's 33 tons of soil that we've kept out of that stream every year. And it's hard to envision 33 tons. So it's like filling 3 of these dump trucks and backing it to the stream and dumping it every year on this 30-acre farm. And in doing that, when the soils are functioning like they should, they also drink a lot more water. And so the water infiltration is so much better. So I figure in this farm, it's almost 2.5 million gallons of water per year that's no longer running off into our streams, causing mass flooding and bringing with it all the sediment and nutrients. So that's about 1,000 dump trucks, I kind of figured. And if you put them end to end, that's almost 5 miles long of dump trucks every year from this 133-acre farm. And along part of the runoff is phosphorus, and phosphorus is the key component to making a lot of our fresh waterways green. And so figure 300 pounds of phosphorus that's attached to that soil that's running off is no longer doing that. And so it basically, that 300 pounds of phosphorus is enough to green up a 300-acre lake that's 10 feet deep every year. And you think, well, where is it then? Well, a lot of times it's running off into our streams. And so the streams are obviously flushing out, and it's ending up in our reservoirs, like in the Wisconsin River. Lake Wisconsin is one that's borders Sauk County, and that greens up pretty badly, I would say about July. I fish that quite a bit. And about July, I don't even bother anymore. It's just greening up. And a lot of it, a majority of it is from the phosphorus running off of our fields. And these are nutrients that we should be keeping on our farms to grow more grass or to grow better corn or beans or whatever it is that we choose to grow. So one of the key points that I'd like to make is that really management is the most important tool for productivity and conservation. It's not necessarily more metal, it's just more observation and management, I would say. Um, we do often do these tests, these infiltration tests, and basically I got some irrigation tubing from a local farmer and cut it into small 10-inch sections, and it's 6-inch diameter, and we pound it into the ground and we fill it with an inch of water and then start the timer to see how long it takes. And a lot of our cropland, it's 60 minutes or more to infiltrate 1 inch of water. But after just a few years in rotational grazing, it's 30 seconds. So we went from 60 minutes to 30 seconds. It's significant. And so much of our water in this situation is really ending up in the ground versus running off and bringing with it flooding and sediment and nutrients. So I think, some would say, well, that sounds good, but you can't make enough money doing it. And I think when we run through the numbers, you can. You can. And what I like about it is that the initial investment's pretty low. What's really necessary? Well, you need fencing, water lines, you got to seed it down. Well, if you can get cost sharing for that, well, that's like very low initial investment then. You have to get animals. Well, what I have folks doing is they get a low interest loan and start a herd that way, and maybe don't worry about buying cows, but buy stockers and sell feeders or sell finished product, but rotate it through, and so you start to um, build your, and it could be sheep, it could be goats, whatever animal agriculture you're interested in. Grazing oftentimes fits that. And here's one of my bigger farms that we converted over a few years ago. This is the Roman Miller farm, and he's got a beef herd here. And this 80-acre piece here is some prime cropland real estate. And I know many of the neighbors weren't exactly thrilled, and people that he knows weren't thrilled that much of that land was going into forage, into grass, into alfalfa, into clover. They thought that should be in corn because it's really good corn ground. It's 175, 200 bushel corn ground, easy. And we kind of sat down together, Roman and I, and ran through the figures. And he's like, well, let's put the whole farm in. And I guess I was thinking we might get 20 acres, but he decided to go all in, and he's never looked back. That's one thing I notice is once people have the courage to go against the grain and to run the numbers to see how profitable something is, and take the risk of being laughed at by neighbors. Once they make that leap, they don't ever go back, because this way of farming really fits a lot of folks. It takes a lot of stress away, I would say. So that prime 200 bushel per acre farm ground, and look at what it produces. It's unbelievable what it produces. And pollinator habitat, we know that the pollinators, their numbers are declining, and obviously they're critical to everything that we do out here in the agricultural sector. And so this promotes more of them. Last fall, I visited a converted farm to rotational grazing in the fall. So it was about, I would say it was September, and maybe it was a later migration, or maybe that was about right. But monarchs descended upon that field, monarch butterflies, and there were hundreds of them out there getting nectar and pollen and everything else from, our red clovers and white clovers that were planted out there, and other things that weren't planted, but they're there. And so bumblebees and native bees and honeybees they were thick in there. And I walked through it. They're busy, feeding themselves, and they really don't bother you. But that really hit home with that landowner. It's like, wow, I've never seen this before. And this is the reason that I farm. this is why I do what I do. And I've been in such a big hurry and under so much stress that I haven't been able to really enjoy these things. And it's the lifestyle. This is the lifestyle that I like. Here's Roman's farm again. Look at all that. And it adds some beauty to it. And there's definitely diversity. And here's that 200 bushel ground again and producing forage like crazy. He just hardly, it's hard to keep up. Here's more of his ground again. And we experimented planting some warm season forage, sorghum sudan, some sunflowers kind of mixed in there. You can see that right here, we didn't tear up the pasture. We just left it alone, overgrazed it and overseeded it and see what comes up. And I think he was experimenting to see how it worked, and his animals grazed on that then that winter. And so those are kind of the things that folks are trying. And on his farm being so big, I figured it was 230 tons of soil we kept out of Narrows Creek. That's 18 dump trucks full of soil every year that we kept out, or about 16 million gallons of water, or about 7,000 dump trucks, and you line them up end to end, and it's 35 miles long. So it's an awful lot of water, and that's off of one farm every year. And it was over 2,000 pounds of phosphorus, which is enough to green up. We have Devil's Lake is a gem that we have here in the county. And it's like taking 5.5 Devil's Lakes if it was 10 feet deep and greening it up every year. During a rain event, I was concerned. Like we had 12 inches of rain in about 4 days. And I thought, okay, I wonder how his pastures are doing. I texted him to check on it, and this is the picture he texted back to me. He goes, "What do you think?" And that's one thing that you notice. That's one thing that I notice often, and I heard it from his own family too, is that people just relax a little more. There's just a lot less stress in this way of doing things. And this, I mean, he used to run corn and beans out there and was always worried about how to make the next payments. And if it rained a lot, well, I might need to add some more fertilizer now. Did a lot of that, denitrify, did a lot of it leach away, what's happening. And now there's no worry of that. What we do is move the animals 3 to 4 times a day for a few days. And because the soil is drained so well, it's ready to be grazed in just a few days. And so Roman's a lot more relaxed, I would say. Here's just another, going to run through some examples of folks that I've worked with over the past few years here. This is a combination dairy. The McCluskey brothers is a combination dairy and beef herd. The dairy being on the right side and the beef herd being on the left side of the road. They seem to be loving that system quite a bit. Here's one, Ken Nolden's farm. This is where he's grazing his dairy heifers. And you can see his dairy facility is right here. And the dairy heifers then are grazed through here. And you put single strand height of polywire here, and they're here for the day. And the next day, put another strand here, and they get moved to here. And you just keep moving them. And the blue line is the water line. And the red line is an interior fence. It's a 1 strand, 32 inches high tensile fence. And so we move them across here until we get to here. And there's a 30-foot opening here, basically. And they walk across. And off we go again, and then we walk. So we basically do one big wheel route. Same thing over here. It's just one wheel route then. Here's another farm. This is the Jaquish Farm. They're going through transitions right now, but it's almost 200 acres of grazing land, and it's a combination of beef, cow, calf, and he's got the dairy cows, the dry cows, and the beef animals grazing in one area, the young heifers, the dairy cows, the breeding heifers, they're all, but I think the goal is then eventually to convert all this into pasture and raise animals here because it's more profitable. We'll just run through the numbers. Here's the Gabe Bauer farm, and they graze beef herd, and he had some corn and some beans and hay, and slowly over time, over the last 3 years, he's converted his whole farm and his uncle's farm to rotational grazing. I think he has over 400 and some acres of rotational grazing on his farm. And the guy is as happy as, yeah, I'll show you a picture of something here that I think you'll appreciate. So that was that farm, and here's his dad's farm that was also converted. Really good pasture ground, really good corn ground for that matter. Here's one converted, basically this area here, this is some flat, I'll show you some pictures, but some flat, very productive ground, I would say. And he decided, I'm done. Let's just convert it all to grass. And so we did. And he got cost sharing for it too. And so here's the posts and miles and miles of water line that were installed. And fences that we generally recommend are high tensile, 4-strand high tensile fence that's electrified. The middle 2 wires are electrified. Here they are. Here's a quick disconnect couplers. And usually these we put underneath fences so they're out of the way. Here's where that big, huge field is. And you can see the dividing lines here. The interior fence is just single strand high tensile. Here, again, another view of that. Here are his animals out there grazing. Very productive ground. And we often would have pasture walks out there too, just to show people how the system works. And on his farm, another classic case, it's 400 pounds of topsoil kept out of the Little Baraboo River. It's like 31 dump trucks every year. That's no longer washing into our waterways and our lakes. And almost 30 million gallons of water, or 12,000 dump trucks, are about 63 miles long if you put them end to end. That's every year. So it's significant. It starts to really add up. And these are just individual farms here and there. I think of the potential of lumping these together and what that could do for the bottom line of landowners that convert this way, what that would do for, I would say, their animals. The animals definitely do better in this system, and what that would do for our environment, for bird habitat, for insects, for butterflies, for the quality of our waterways and our fishing holes and all those things. I think there's a benefit all around. And on his farm, over 3,600 pounds of phosphorus, enough to green up almost 10 Devils Lakes. And one of the things that's significant to him is he says, this is the first time we've been able to take a family vacation. And they went to Glacier National Park that year with the rotational grazing system. He had a neighbor come and check on the animals about every 3 days or so, and all was well. And I think he's just a much happier man since converting over to grass. And so I like to leave you with a few questions that I'd like to ask our producers. This is very loaded here, and that's okay. I'll just pick out a few of them. But one of the things that I really want landowners to think about when we sit down together is why they're doing what they're doing. Does it make sense, say, to finish animals or sell them as feeders, or do we want to sell calves? How do we generate cash flow? Should we raise pigs, turkeys, cattle, sheep, or all the above? Should I invest in my own haying equipment or just buy hay? And if you decide to, to make your own hay, what is the true cost to me of making a ton of hay? We really sit there and hammer through the numbers. What is the true cost of degrading my soils and groundwater or surface water? And these are all things that affect me eventually. And so we kind of go through the costs of that. Does it make sense to grow more corn and beans? How truly profitable is so much row crop in my operation? And does it make sense for me to diversify or just change my enterprise altogether? And you can't, it's hard to make some of those decisions unless you run through the numbers. And so that's one thing we'll do then is then how truly profitable, who is truly profiting from the enterprise I am choosing? Is it agribusiness or is it me? And we would like it to be the farmer as much as possible. Obviously, agribusiness has a role to play, but we'd like to have the farmers more profitable. Over time, if some of you may have seen that graph, but over time, the share of the income that agribusiness takes in versus what the farmers take in, they're going in opposite directions, and you can guess which one's going up and which one's going down. Is it profitable to imitate nature in our farming practices? Is it better to have high production or very high profit? I think so much of us get stuck on the production piece and we forget about the profit piece. Yep, maybe you made 150 bushel per acre corn, but you were more productive than someone who had 250 bushel per acre corn because your inputs are so much lower. So we kind of go through that. And then we have to get down into that deeper level, that psychological level too, a little bit. It's like, are we doing this for bragging rights or are we doing this for profit? And, I'd like to call people out on that. So what are you really doing this for? And again, some of you who are no-tillers, you think this is a no-brainer, of course. Is it economical to make 3 passes with a piece of equipment when 1 pass will do, as in a no-till planter? Is it economical to plant cover crops with my row crop system? If so, why? And how much? And what are the benefits? And then we kind of have to get down into that, like, what do I truly want out of this farm life? Is it emotional security, financial security? Do I feel safe in the nest here? Am I willing to venture out? Should I be doing something else? Why am I even doing this anyway? What's the point? I mean, if your heart's not into it and you feel like you're on a treadmill, maybe it's time to get off. And maybe grazing is a nice, natural place to get off. Or maybe it isn't. Can I interest the next generation of farmers with the way that I am financially managing or mismanaging the business? And do I even enjoy this enterprise and this way of life anymore? These are just some of the questions we'll hammer through, and it'll take 1 or 2 couple hours at least to kind of sort through what makes sense and how to tweak the enterprise. But I do think, and this is why it's happening so much in our county, I do think there are alternatives, and one of the big alternatives is converting that cropland over to grass. If it grows good corn and beans, trust me, it grows really good grass and legumes, and we let the animals do the fertilizing. So yes, maybe you don't make $500,000 a year. I should say cash flow $500,000 a year, but maybe you don't need to if the input costs are minimal. But you're also not taking out a big loan either at the same time. And so I just think it's something worth looking into. So if you have any questions, feel free, to contact me. My email address is there. My phone number is there. Feel free to dig in, and I'm happy to sit down, or we can do it over phone or something. But consider it. It's not something that a lot of folks think about as a viable alternative. And I know that it's good for the environment. I can see that and I can prove that. We've measured that. But lately, we've been able to show and prove that it's also good for the pocketbook of farmers. And we need more successful farmers out in the landscape protecting our natural resources. And so thank you so much. Thanks for listening. And please consider it. All right, that's it.